All right, hello everybody, welcome back. Really quick, while I have your attention, and before I forget, the poll from last week about doing a summative assessment was overwhelmingly no. It was like 90% no, 10% yes. If you are one of the people that voted yes, and you're concerned about summative assessment impact on your grade, because I'm assuming that's why you wanted to do another one, is to have one more to balance it out. Email me. We could figure something out. It might just be, like doing some kind of retake, or I don't know. But your summative assessment portion of your grade is not set in stone. If you would like to do something about it, email me and we will figure something out. All right, so it's time to talk about North Korea. And it's good timing to talk about North Korea because there's actually some pretty significant potential stuff in the news about them lately. I'll talk about that at the end here. Last week we talked about Japan, and I mentioned that was important for talking about Korea because that's a big part of that is how America gets involved, because Korea was controlled by Japan during World War II. When America rolls in, we mostly fight in the Pacific in terms of the major allies on our own, like the Philippines helps us out, Australia helps us out, China helps us out. But when it comes to taking Korea, for example, that's America rolling in and doing that. If you recall from the Korean War stuff you guys covered last year, which hopefully you remember at least some of it, you might know that the way we end up with North and South Korea is that America has taken South Korea by the end of the war. We are rushing by the end of the war to finish it before Russia can join in. Rushing, Russia, got it, cool. Russia manages to come into the war on the Pacific anyway, even though we try to end the war before they can. They actually continue fighting for 2 weeks after Japan agrees to stop fighting. And in that time, they take a bunch of territory, and part of that territory is what is now North Korea. So the north-south split of Korea really just comes down to what territory was controlled by Russia and what was controlled by America after Japan's occupation during World War II. When that all goes down, America and Russia both separately set up our own governments in our parts of Korea, and then we back out of the region. In the north, obviously, you get a communist government. In the south, you get a super air quotes democratic government. It was a dictatorship. I mean, the status quo for Cold War America. We support dictatorships as long as they are anti-communist. Importantly for the South, though, when America withdrew from that region, we didn't want them to start a conflict that would pull us into another war in the region. So we restricted their military, which was really unfortunate when North Korea, with their big military, invaded the South. The South had a pretty big chunk of land. They had a pretty good chunk of population, but the North had more defensible territory. They had more resource-rich territory, and it just kind of worked out in their favor, and Russia made sure they had a functioning military. So they invade the South. They almost completely take over Korea before America convinces the UN to do a UN peacekeeping action, which was actually led by 80%, I believe, of the... if I'm remembering my numbers correctly, 80% of the forces that participated were American forces, and it was led by an American general. It was an American war, but it was a, air quotes, UN peacekeeping action, which Russia did not get to veto because they were boycotting the UN over America insisting that Taiwan was China and China was not China. So that ends the way it started, with Korea just split completely down the middle, which brings us to our notes topic. Quick heads up, I made this PowerPoint in 2017 for World Studies. Back at my old school, we had a different year set up, and I was able to get into some modern stuff. So every year I would do modern connections on topics that were going on. And if you remember, in 2017, there was a big what-if conversation on whether or not America and North Korea were coming to terms on North Korea getting rid of their nuclear stuff, and if North and South Korea were finally going to sign an actual peace agreement, because remember, they only have an armistice. There's no actual peace agreement that has ever been signed for the Korean War, so it's technically still ongoing. So I made this PowerPoint in 2017 in the spring when all of that was ongoing. And honestly, because I'm a little bit lazy and tired, I'm not going to like fully update it here, but we are going to talk about the updates to it. So some of the stuff I reference is going to be 2017 stuff, and then I'll update you as we go through it. So I always like to start with this when I talk about North Korea. I don't know if I showed this to you guys this year already, but this should be an easy answer. It's apparently not. If I recall correctly, this is a mid-2010s, I think like 2015-ish survey of a little bit under 2,000 Americans, and like a chunk of them got it. Like there's some correct answers in there. There's some that, just don't know the difference between North and South, apparently. And then there's other stuff. So clearly America doesn't have a very strong understanding of what's going on in North Korea. We just hear what's in the news, and that's pretty much it. But there's a lot to it. So after the Korean War, the guy who's in charge is not this dude. This is Kim Jong-il. The meme here, Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-ok, which is super relevant given the current update about what's going on. It's got Kim Jong-il, his son Kim Jong-un, but we'll get to that. So this guy's dad, Kim Il-sung, became the first premier of North Korea. He was supported by Russia initially, but he kind of bounced around between like Russia and China being independent. North Korea has always had a big thing about like they're a big kid and everybody needs to respect them, but then they also kind of rely on mostly China, but early on Russia as well. So Kim Il-sung's actually around for a while. He doesn't die until 94. So for me, when I think of North Korea, I still kind of reflexively think of Kim Jong-il, because that's the guy who was in charge, when I was a kid and I heard about North Korea, and it was always Kim Jong-il. But he is the one that gets the power passed to him. When the USSR fell apart, that was a really bad problem for North Korea. Like it was for a lot, like we talked about this with Cuba as well, a lot of those kind of more distant satellite states that kind of depended on Russia for aid, well, that doesn't happen anymore when the USSR collapses. And that puts North Korea in a weird economic spot because nobody really likes North Korea. Even China, who is their one remaining like kind of close ally, has increasingly gotten sick of their stuff, and like even China doesn't really like North Korea. So when North Korea loses that aid from Russia, which they were getting because they were ostensibly communist, they were anti-American, now they're going to be in a rough spot economically. We also got Kim Jong-il. I got some North Korea memes, you guys. I'm a fan of them. I don't know about you guys. I like puns, but take it for what you will. So China then is going to kind of fill the void for them, but they run into a problem there because China is, in the 90s, kind of trying to expand their horizons as well. So they open diplomatic ties with South Korea, which obviously North Korea has difficulties with. So that makes North Korea even more like in a rough spot because now their remaining big ally is also opening up ties with somebody who North Korea has a lot of tensions with. So North Korea decides they need to rely more on that independence, on being the big kid, and people can't push them around. And how do you do that? Nukes. So in the early 90s, North Korea starts, getting into nuclear research, for self-defense. They're not going to use it offensively, they say. They're just for defending themselves from all their unnecessarily hostile neighbors. This is sarcasm speaking. We don't know exactly when they got nukes, but we do know between 2005 2006 is when they finished their nuclear program. And what I want to point out when I talk about nukes in North Korea, these are not American-level nukes. These are not Russian-level nukes. These are, their first nukes were actually less powerful than the ones that we dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So, yeah, they get nuclear weapons in 2005, 2006. They're not very strong. And the other huge part, if you remember back to our Cold War unit, nukes on their own are scary, but without an ICBM, how is North Korea, think about their neighbors, right? They could launch a nuke at South Korea. That would be bad. We wouldn't want that. That's the only target they would get. They wouldn't launch a nuke at Russia. They wouldn't launch a nuke at China. And their early nuclear capabilities, their launching systems couldn't even hit Japan, who would be their next closest neighbor. So it's a threat, but it's not like a global threat or anything. So Kim Jong-il dies in 2011, and there's this kind of moment of uncertainty of like who's going to take power next. Like, is it going to be his brother? All this other stuff, but it's his son. Kim Jong-un comes in. Kim Jong-un actually has his uncle assassinated because his uncle might be a threat to his power, but that's once he actually takes power. And Kim Jong-un likes him some nukes. And he has been accelerating the nuclear program in North Korea since, he consolidated his power in 2012. He has been pushing forward with that nuclear program. So how does North Korea function then? As we're talking about, their international stuff with nukes, I've mentioned a few times their economy is doing rough, and they're kind of a communist country. They're a dictatorship, like all basically historical communist countries. They're actually just dictatorships. They're not actually communist. So how does North Korea function? Well, like all dictatorships, they rely on some pretty intense propaganda. I'm going to, for the second part of this week's activities, I'm going to link a couple of videos. One of them is like, you have to watch it, and then like the other ones will just kind of be like some, if you want to watch this, is kind of cool. And the amount of propaganda that you can see going on is just, it's mind-boggling. Like, we talk about, Nazi Germany, and we talk about their propaganda and the Hitler Youth and stuff like that. That's child's play compared to what you see going on in North Korea. I just realized the unintentional pun with calling the Hitler Youth child's play. Okay, that I wasn't trying to make a joke about the Hitler Youth thing. Anyway, moving on. So propaganda, super, super strong. They have complete control over basically the news media and everything that people are seeing. There is an illicit trade in like Hollywood movies and stuff like that, but it's illegal to own those, and you can get in big trouble if you do. For the most part, North Korea is going to be able to control everything their citizens see. So the people of North Korea think, for example, that North Korea has beat America in multiple wars, and that North Korea is a major global power, and that everybody respects them. And like we send a lot of aid, humanitarian aid, that's the third bullet point here, to North Korea. And what North Korea will do is just claim that they got that by intimidating the UN and intimidating America, and they forced them to give us that food. This is the North Korean government speaking. So that propaganda is really intense. Obviously, there's that support from historically Russia, then China, and Russia and China still support North Korea to an extent, and that's a huge factor in stopping us from just invading North Korea. Because if we did, I don't know, these days maybe China would choose not to back them up, but there's always the chance that would be World War III, basically. They do get a lot of humanitarian aid. The main sources of this are actually some of their main enemies. You get the UN, of course, but then you also get the US and South Korea. Especially because starting in the 90s, North Korea has basically been in a constant state of famine. It's like never ending. It goes up and down. Sometimes it gets better, then it gets worse again. But basically, there's never enough food in North Korea. And you might be like, well, wait a minute. South Korea, US, why would we be giving them aid? Like, they're a horrible dictatorship. Yes, they are. But who are we giving aid to if we're giving them food? We're not giving it to Kim Jong-un, although technically we are. We're trying to feed the people of North Korea. This is the real prickly pear issue of how do you deal with North Korea. You have to be able to separate the government of North Korea and the people of North Korea. And when we look at a famine, the people that are suffering are the people of North Korea. And yes, the government is going to use that humanitarian aid against us. They're going to use it for propaganda. So are you just going to let millions of people starve to death because their government is bad? So we do end up giving them a lot of aid. There's also the hope that if we give them aid, the government will be a little bit more open to us. South Korea actually still really wants to unify. They want to be one unified country again, like they were before Japan took over. So South Korea still views North Korean citizens as basically their countrymen. A lot of them, and this is increasingly less common because as people get older and die, but especially up until recently, you got to remember that a lot of families actually, like, they would have family members on both sides of Korea, right, in North and South. So it definitely makes sense for South Korea to be sending humanitarian aid up there. And then finally, the way that diplomatically North Korea is able to throw its weight around is basically by negotiating with their nuclear program. And this doesn't necessarily mean threatening to nuke people, although they do that every now and then. More often, it's agreeing to dismantle parts of their nuclear program in exchange for something, and then they break those agreements later. That's just their thing. So in terms of China, I mentioned a few times that China and Russia are kind of their go-to backups here. So you can see here the China-North Korea trade volume throughout the 2000s. Again, I made this in 2017, so 2016 was the most recent I had. But it definitely spikes up, but then it kind of starts to drop down a little bit mid-range. So North Korea and China have economic and political ties because, they were both communist during the Cold War. They both had all that stuff going on. They're both closely linked in terms of geography and in terms of history. So China gets some minor economic benefits out of this. More importantly, they get a buffer between them and, American-backed South Korea and Japan. Because if North Korea were to, fall to South Korea, that would be basically America, South Korea, Japan, all right on the border of China, and they don't want that. That's why China got involved in the Korean War. On top of that, it's in China's best interest to try to stabilize North Korea, because people, when they're starving to death and when they're, economically in a crisis, they tend to flee the country. And North Korea, you can be executed for trying to flee the country. In fact, your family could be executed for you trying to flee the country. But people still do it because they're starving to death. And if you're going to starve to death or be executed, you might as well at least try for the option where you could maybe get away. If people are fleeing from North Korea, there's two options: South Korea and China. So if things are really bad in North Korea, there's going to be a bunch of refugees constantly trying to come into China. If North Korea is being super aggressive with their nuclear program, that means that China's next door neighbor is this wildly unstable chaos force that might draw them into a world war. So China wants to keep North Korea stable because it's their backyard. That being said, support has decreased over time. Keep in mind, trade volume in sheer numbers is not always the best way to look at things, because percentage of how much money they're actually making could still go down over time. And since 2006, especially with that nuclear testing that they've got going on, China has actually kind of pulled back their support. And you can definitely see that kind of coming through here, where it looks like, oh, that's actually remaining even, but remember, China's economy is still doing this, right? So this is actually a downturn in the support they're giving. So China has supported sanctions. They don't always enforce them. China's kind of like a mid-range, kind of in support of North Korea force here. South Korea, constant high tensions. As I mentioned before, they're always trying to figure out possibilities for reunification, but it always comes down to South Korea wants to do it on South Korea's terms, and North Korea wants to do it on North Korea's terms. And North Korea is a dictatorship, right? There's no middle ground. You can't decide to merge governments. That's not how a dictatorship works. As soon as the Kim family loses hegemony over North Korea, they're in big trouble, right? So the idea of reunification is nearly impossible unless the Kim family collapses, basically. So there's all kinds of threats. There's border skirmishes. There's spies going back and forth, especially under Kim Il-sung. People are kidnapped from South Korea and taken to the north. When I was living in Japan, at first I thought people were just being kind of crazy, especially old people in Japan would talk about, when you were walking late at night when they were young, they had to be careful of North Korean spies coming over and kidnapping people and taking them to North Korea. And I was like, what? That is crazy. There's no way that actually happened. So that's a huge issue. We'll talk about that a little bit later here. In the early 2000s, there was this thing called the Sunshine Policy that was implemented to try to improve relations. But it was maybe a good idea on paper if implemented differently, but basically what it came down to is be nice to North Korea no matter what. And the end result then came out to be that North Korea just got to basically do whatever it wanted for about 8 years until the policy was abandoned in 2010. Somewhat recently, a kind of updated version of it has been brought in. There have been like joint ventures. For example, there is a shared factory that still exists. It's actually in North Korean territory, but it's kind of like right on the border. And what basically happens is South Korean workers come up there and they work together with North Korean workers. And this is supposed to help the economy of North Korea while giving them kind of like an olive branch that they work on together. The problem is the North Korean government, when they get pissed, very often just decides to like shut down that factory as like a punishment to the South. It's not punishing the South. They don't rely on that economically, but it's more of like a middle finger to the South, right? So basically relations between North and South Korea are characterized by the South constantly trying to find new ways to improve relations, and the North kind of finding new ways to take advantage of the South trying to improve relations. America. This one is the one that you're probably most familiar with. We want to do everything we can to force North Korea out of power. Specifically, we want to force the Kim family out of power. And there's a lot of motivations for that. A huge one is the humanitarian concerns. As a dictatorship, they are incredibly repressive and harsh towards their people. But we also, the same reason why we got into the Korean War in the first place, we want more influence in that region, and having North Korea out would be a big part of that. We don't like the fact that they have nukes. We want to get that kind of threat out of the way. So, we do give humanitarian aid, but we also get really aggressive with economic sanctions, put a lot of military pressure on them. We operate out of South Korea as kind of like a military cooperative force, and even when the Sunshine Policy is going on in the South, America was still pushing pretty aggressively. Obviously, we're not invading the North, but we do things like every year we have like military demonstrations like right on the border so that North Korea can see it, and North Korea does the same thing. So we're much more aggressive when it comes to North Korea. And what I always hear, probably not from you guys, but whenever I bring this up in like world studies, I always get those kids that are like, why don't we just nuke them? We could just nuke all of Korea. Or like, why don't we just go to war with them? Even if Russia and China chose not to get involved, and it wasn't World War III, this is, and we'll talk about the Middle East as well, so I'll bring up the same thing then. If you go in and you invade and you're just dropping bombs and you're killing everybody, it goes back to the humanitarian issue. Who are you killing? You're killing the civilians of North Korea that have nothing to do. In fact, they're the victims of the government, right? So you're trying to get rid of the North Korean government, and to do that, you're killing the victims of the North Korean government, right? It's a lose-lose-lose situation. Like everybody loses all the way down. So it's not as simple as just invading or like, just assassinating the leader or anything like that. Because even if you just assassinated like the entire Kim family, right? You still have a dictatorship structure set up. So you're going to have a power vacuum. Some other dictator is going to step in, and it's just going to be the same problem over again. So as much as it would be nice for it to be as simple as just invade and do it, that would never really work. And I mean, we saw how just invading worked in the Middle East. It hasn't. So what is happening now? And keep in mind, now was 2017. This was up until recently the big news coming from North Korea. So in May of 2017, Moon Jae-in, and I know I'm probably butchering all of these pronunciations, I'm sorry, was elected president in South Korea, and that's when they decided we're going to go back to the Sunshine Policy. But again, it was more of an updated Sunshine Policy. It wasn't do whatever North Korea wants us to do. It was more of like trying to keep things calm and improve relations. So Kim Jong-un then shocked everybody by hopping on board. And he goes, hey, how about this? Let's send one delegation to the Olympics. So that we'll march with South Korea. We'll do it under one flag. We'll go in together, and we'll march as one country. And that's huge because remember, South Korea's main goal here is they want to reunify with the North. So this is basically, to a lot of people, they're like, oh wow, this is a signal that North Korea is not necessarily willing to merge into one country or anything, but they're willing to do things as just Korea instead of just North and South Korea. April 27th, so before May, leading up into all of this, Kim Jong-un actually went and visited the South. That's something that his father didn't do, his grandfather after the Korean War didn't do. There had been no North Korean leader that visited the South since the Korean War, and he did that in April 27th. He's like, hey, let's get to work on this. He did not sign a peace agreement, but what he did sign is an agreement to work with the South towards achieving peace and something that America is was really excited about, removing all nuclear weapons from the peninsula and eventually talking about reunification. And this was huge. Everybody's like, oh my God, are we going to finally see the end of the Korean War? And maybe we're going to see one unified Korea. Maybe Kim Jong-un had a Snickers and now he's feeling better. Maybe something good's coming out of this. So at the point that I did this, I was presenting this PowerPoint in May of 2017. Nothing had really happened yet. There had just been an agreement to work towards something. Peace was supposed to be hashed out by the end of the year. The South Korean president was going to visit the North in the fall, and they were going to kind of figure out the exact terms of the peace treaty. It was going to be more of a symbolic thing. Like, it's not like North and South Korea were fighting the Korean War at that point. On May 12th, North Korea announced on the nuclear side of things, which is what was getting a lot of press in America, because reunification of Korea, sure, we'd like that, but what we really cared about was getting rid of their nukes, right? And I'm not even going to try to pronounce the nuclear test site that they were going to dismantle, but they announced they were going to begin dismantling the test site. It was going to happen between May 23rd and May 25th. There was going to be a meeting with America 3 weeks later, and then there was going to be some more peace talks and everything. They would still have production sites for nukes, but their test sites were like, this was their main nuclear test site, right? So if they took that out, that'd be great. There was an immediate question then of like, why? Why is this happening? And by the way, when I say why, I don't know why I did this to you guys. I found it, and it's glorious. All right, so anyway, why suddenly is North Korea, or was North Korea, being so friendly? Why were they being so willing to talk reunification? Why were they being so willing to talk nukes? We still don't know. The problem with North Korea is it's almost impossible to get clear answers because they're so closed off and so repressive. You're constantly getting like experts on North Korea who like make predictions and they make guesses, and you get like bits and pieces of information that come out of North Korea, but you always kind of have to try to piece together like motivations and real thought process behind it. So one possibility is that there were new sanctions coming out against North Korea, and China had agreed to support these. Most significantly, China was going to cut off coal exports. This is the main thing that was being traded to China. China was then going to buy a lot of coal from America instead, so America viewed this as a win. But North Korea's economy, which is already doing really bad, was now going to be dealt a huge blow if China followed through with this. That meant that China was not only pulling away from North Korea, they were pulling closer to North Korea's main international enemy in their minds, which was America. They were looking at like more coal, more natural gas, and that screws over North Korea in multiple levels. So China then follows up. Wait a minute. Oh, I screwed up some of the dates on this. I was doing this. I was giving this in 2018. Sorry, my brain is not functioning properly. I said this whole thing like I did this in 2017 because the folder was called 2017. That was the school year that started in 2017. So this was spring of 2018. My apologies. Brain no worky. So November of 2017 then, there was a meeting that we don't know the details of, because China didn't publish the details, and obviously North Korea is not going to publish the details. What we do know is that a key diplomat from China visited North Korea right after that trade deal with the U.S. was announced and put into place. It was just a couple of months later when, out of nowhere, for the January 2018 Winter Olympics, and that should have been my cue that I wasn't doing this in 2017 because I was talking about the 2018 Olympics, whatever. My brain's all scattered. I'm 6 weeks into still having symptoms of whatever I have, and I'm finding it very hard to focus. Anyway, so suddenly, 2 months after this secret meeting, Kim Jong-un is being really friendly towards South Korea and towards America, almost like he's really desperate to start opening up North Korea and finding like new avenues for trade, or maybe almost like China came in and said, hey, you guys better get your stuff together and start playing nice, or we're going to completely abandon you. Adding to that theory, Kim Jong-un met with the president of China on March 28, 2018, and less than a month after that, we see the nuclear stuff starting to happen, right? So there's a very clear pattern of North Korea kind of being backed into a corner, and then they meet with China, and then suddenly they're more open. So the main theory still is that China basically told them they needed to fall in line because they were sick of dealing with their aggressive behavior, and that was that. So we're not going to do the six-party talks activity. We're just going to skip that. Here is how I ended my not 2017, 2018 PowerPoint. I ended it with a prediction. And I'm not going to toot my own horn. I'm going to toot my own horn here. My prediction was absolutely correct. My prediction was all of this was just a facade. North Korea was not going to do anything notable. They were going to back out of all their deals. The planned talks weren't going to happen. And that is exactly how it went down. They said they dismantled the testing site, but they didn't allow people to observe them doing it. They let people come in after the fact to confirm that it had been dismantled, but that means they could have just moved it anywhere. The peace talks that were supposed to happen in the fall of 2018 just didn't really go through. There's been no talks of reunification. Everything fell apart. But here was my kind of what I called my summarized timeline of pessimism, my background for why I didn't think anything was going to happen. North Korea has a history of doing this. In the 1970s, we see détente going on in China with America. North Korea is then going to start backing down their hostile actions. They were doing things like trying to assassinate the South Korean president. They were seizing American ships. They were shooting down planes. And suddenly they go, okay, détente, let's start talking a little bit of peace here. In 72, they get this agreement where two sides are going to start to reunify. Does this sound familiar yet? And then in 1973, discussions were unilaterally, that means the North just decided on their own without explaining, cut off. So same exact situation, just spread out more. They're like, hey, let's start talking peace, let's start talking reunification, and then just bam, nothing. Again, in the 1980s, Kim Il-sung proposes a plan for reunification. They were going to confederate. They were going to have equal representation for the North and the South. Then, 3 years later, the North carries out a bombing attack to try to assassinate the president of South Korea, kills 17 people. 1987, they detonate another bomb in South Korea. This was on a South Korean flight. All 115 people were killed. We put North Korea on the list of state sponsors of terrorism. We removed them from that in 2008 because they promised to reduce their nuclear weapon research, which they didn't. Then the two countries decided no more contact for the rest of the 1980s because the North was being too aggressive. Again in the 90s, the North and the South North and the South are admitted to the UN. And they start talking non-aggression, reconciliation, denuclearization. Those agreements go into effect. And then North Korea doesn't suspend their nuclear program. People start complaining, especially South Korea, and North Korea cuts off all contact with South Korea. As we get into the mid-90s, again, North Korea promises to freeze nuclear program if they get economic aid from America. Then 2 years later, they announced they're no longer going to abide by the armistice that ended the Korean War, and they send thousands of troops into the demilitarized zone. As we get into the 2000s, the South Korean president becomes the first South Korean head of state to visit the North, kind of like, the reverse what we saw in 2018. There's a major summit that starts talks of tension, like reducing tensions and reunifying. And then in 2002, North and South Korean naval vessels waged a gun battle in the Yellow Sea. North Korea announced it's reactivating its nuclear facilities. It expels UN inspectors. And then the next year, they withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It's like they have like multiple personalities, right? They promise to be friendly, and then they just completely go off the deep end the other way. Just the quick end to the timeline of pessimism here. And this is probably a little bit late to say this, but you guys don't really need to like write down every single part of this as notes. More of just North Korea promises to start playing nice, and then they just break all their promises. So in 2007, South Korea gives $50 million in aid for flood relief. The South Korean president goes to the North. They restart talks again. The North gives full access to one of their nuclear testing sites in exchange for America taking it off the blacklist. And then the next year, North Korea cancels all military and political deals with the South and says it's guilty of hostile intent and starts upping their programs again. As that final bullet point says, I could add way more things to this, but you get the idea. There is a pattern of behavior from North Korea here. So you can't really expect that they're going to do anything different in 2018, and they didn't do anything different in 2018. This is par for the course in how North Korea functions. They make whatever promises they need to make to get whatever short-term economic or political goals they want to achieve. And once they achieve that, they just cut off all ties. And you run into the problem of they know that at the end of the day, what are you going to do about it? You going to invade them? Well, we already talked about why that wouldn't really be possible. So you can't really do anything about it. So because America and South Korea and the global community are kind of desperate to do something to make things work with North Korea can be as irrational and just chaotic as they want to be, because people will always try to placate them. And really, there's not many other options than to try to figure out a way to get them to play nice, because again, the only other option is invasion. So at the very beginning of this, I mentioned that it was convenient timing because there's some stuff going on in the news with North Korea. You might have heard about it. If you haven't heard about it, here's the latest. Now in spring, May. Oh, it's April still. Yeah, I'm recording this on April 26th. So next week will be like April/May. Kim Jong-un might be dead. Basically, I think it was about 2 days ago I started to see the first reports popping up. Might have been 3 days ago. There were reports trickling out of North Korea. They were not official statements from the government. We get these from like kind of spies, but usually like defectors or like sources we have in the government. We got sources saying that Kim Jong-un was in critical condition in the hospital. He had undergone some kind of surgery, and there was like potential complications from it. And he may or may not be in the hospital. Obviously, you get a bunch of reports coming out from North Korea of like Kim Jong-un is in deep meditation, or Kim Jong-un's relaxing at the beach because he's not appearing in public. And this is pretty normal, par for the course stuff for North Korea as well. Like Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, when he had medical issues, it was the same thing of like he would disappear and people would be like, I wonder what's going on, if he's like sick or something. And then there'd be all kinds of propaganda coming out from the government. I believe actually Kim Jong-un, like 5 years back, had some similar, like he was not in public for a while and people were like kind of figuring out like, is he sick? Is he dead? What's up? But like today, there was new reports saying that we have received information from some sources in the North Korean government that Kim Jong-un is actually dead. That his condition deteriorated and he has died, and that's that. Obviously, still, we don't have any news or any official statement from the North Korean government. We get incorrect information kind of frequently from North Korea, so it could turn out that like maybe he is in deep meditation and like at the beach hanging out or whatever. But there's also a chance that Kim Jong-un is gone. And if he is gone, it's probably his younger sister that will take power, because power has passed through the Kim family so far. And he does not have a son or a daughter. He doesn't have any children yet. He does have a wife, but yeah. So we might be seeing some really interesting changes in North Korea at this rate if he has actually died. But that's just time will tell, I guess. So that's all of our North Korea stuff. As I mentioned, I'm going to post some videos for you guys to watch and just kind of take some really simplistic notes on. Honestly, I think they're like super duper interesting. I'm going to have like the main one I'm going to definitely assign to you is a little bit older. It's actually from when Kim Jong-il was in power. But the thing about North Korea is it doesn't really change that much. So you could just replace Kim Jong-il with Kim Jong-un, or, you know, maybe his younger sister pretty soon here. And it'll be basically the same documentary. I have another one that's a little bit more recent, and it's pretty good. I just don't think it covers stuff as well as the first one does. And then I'll probably attach some YouTube videos of like interviews / questions with people who escaped North Korea as well. So thank you guys for listening. Have a good day. Let me know if you have any questions. Bye.